All right, Strangler Fig Pattern. Kind of a weird name, right? Sounds like something you'd hear on a nature show. But no, we're talking software.
Yeah, you get it.
Big software.
Yeah.
And specifically, how to modernize it. Like, think about those huge applications, the ones that have been around forever.
Oh, yeah. Like from the old days, those on-premise servers, PHP monoliths.
Yeah, you've been there, haven't you? Migrating those, breaking them apart into microservices, Node.js, the whole thing. You must have some stories.
Oh, yeah. Many of us have. Those legacy systems, they can be a real mess.
A tangled mess, hard to update, scale, you name it.
Right.
And look, I get it. Microservices sound great. But just ripping out the old system, starting from scratch, nobody wants that downtime, the risk. Stakeholders wouldn't be happy.
No, not at all.
So that's where the Strangler Fig idea comes in, right?
Yeah.
More gradual, less disruptive. Like, I guess it's like a Strangler fig tree growing around another one.
You got it. Instead of that big bang rewrite, you build new microservices, but around the old monolith, piece by piece.
Okay, that makes sense. A lot risky than just blowing it all up. But let me play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
I've worked with my share of those PHP monoliths, and let's just say well-defined boundaries weren't exactly their strong point.
Yeah, I hear you.
How do you even start breaking that into microservices? Where do you even begin?
That's where domain-driven design becomes super important. You have to analyze it, see where the functional boundaries are, figure out which parts you can actually pull out without creating a bigger mess.
So like those Node.js microservices, each one doing its own thing.
Exactly, that same clarity.
Gotcha. Each microservice gets its own little piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that cause other problems? Like data consistency. Those old monoliths, they usually have one giant database.
Yeah.
How do you manage that when you have all these independent microservices running around?
That is a crucial point. Ideally, each microservice would have its own database, right? Tailored to what it needs. But during the transition, you got to have ways to keep the data in sync between those new services and that old database.
I see. So like what, event-driven updates, that kind of thing.
Right, could be. Data replication. You might even use a unified API gateway. That way the client doesn't even see where the data is coming from.
So it's not just splitting the application logic, it's managing that data too. Sounds pretty complex.
It can be.
But all right, let's say we've got our boundaries figured out, the data strategy is in place, we're building microservices. How do we actually make the old system use the new stuff, like redirect the traffic?
That's where the proxy layer comes in. Think of it like a traffic cop. Sits between the outside world and your application.
Oh, okay.
So the proxy, it sees every request, decides, okay, does this go to the old monolith or to this new microservice based on the rules you set up?
So we're kind of tricking the system into using the new code. Pretty sneaky. But hold on, wouldn't a proxy slow things down? We're already dealing with old code. We don't need more bottlenecks.
That's a good point. Performance is key. You need the right proxy solution, something that can handle the load, scale up when it needs to, ideally something that works well with your cloud provider too.
Right, so the proxy itself can't be a bottleneck. Makes sense. Now I'm curious, when you're doing this for real, where's a good place to start? What's the first piece you strangle, so to speak? Do you go for something small, low risk, or is there a more strategic way to choose?
It's kind of both, really. You want something well-defined, fairly independent, but you also want to target areas that are going to make a difference quickly, show some value early on.
Okay. So maybe something like user authentication. It's kind of separate from the main logic, but it can really benefit from being its own thing, scaling and all that.
Exactly. And by starting with something contained, you prove out the process, work out the kinks, get some confidence before you go after the more complex parts.
Like dipping your toes in the water before you jump in the deep end.
I
I like it. This whole thing is starting to make sense. But one more thing. Those new microservices, they got to talk to the old monolith, right? How do you handle that communication? Two different worlds, essentially.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting. You might need some glue code. Sometimes it's called an anti-corruption layer. It's like a translator between the data formats and all that, between the old and the new.
Huh. So we're building bridges, making sure they can understand each other. But wouldn't that be a lot of extra work? I mean, we're already building new services, strangling the old ones.
You're right, it does add complexity. But often it's necessary, Think of it as an investment.
Right.
By keeping those boundaries clear, between the old and the new, you're making sure the old problems don't creep into your shiny new microservices.
Okay, long-term thinking, I see that. So we're being strategic about what we strangle.
Yeah.
We're using a proxy to redirect traffic, maybe building some translation layers too. This is a whole operation.
It can be.
But hey, Imagine the payoff.
Right.
Updating and scaling things independently, releasing features faster, and eventually no more legacy code.
It's good feeling.
That does sound pretty nice. All right, so we've got the basics of this Strangler Fig pattern down. But before we go too far, I want to dig a little deeper into the practical stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
Like, how do you actually do this? Specific tools, technologies. You've done this before. What have you learned along the way?
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. The devil's in the details. One big thing I've learned is that the cloud can be your best friend here. Like, think about those AWS migrations you've done.
Mm-hmm.
Tools like API Gateway, incredibly useful for that proxy layer we were talking about.
Right, right. Okay, so API Gateway becomes our traffic cop.
Mm-hmm.
But, even simple routing logic, it can get messy fast,
Mm-hmm.
especially with things like sessions, user authentication, all that. How do you keep it from becoming a tangled mess itself?
That's where understanding your application's domain is so important. And how the data flows.
Yeah.
You got to design your routing rules to match those boundaries, minimize the need for all that communication between services.
Oh, I see.
So, for example, let's say you're strangling out a user authentication service, right? Mm-hmm.
You could route all the requests that go to, like, the off path. You send them straight to that new service. Keep that logic nice and contained.
Ah, okay. So it's like creating clear lanes of traffic.
Exactly.
But what about actually building those new microservices? We've moved a lot of PHP to Node.js. I'm always curious about that choice.
Right.
Do you stick with what you know or try something totally new?
That's a great question. There's no one answer, really.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes sticking with what your team knows is the fastest way,
Makes sense.
but other times, starting fresh with a language or framework that's a better fit, that might be the way to go. The beauty of microservices is you have that choice.
Right. Pick the right tool for the job. Like, I'm thinking about AWS Lambda. It seems perfect for these lightweight microservices,
Yeah.
especially for like API endpoints, event-driven stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Lambda being serverless, it's a huge advantage here. You spit up new functions quickly, they scale on their own, no server management.
Right, right. Plus, it works great with API Gateway, the whole flow from request to execution. It's nice and smooth.
So that's the application logic. But we talked about the data, each microservice having its own database.
Right.
How do you manage all those databases in the cloud, especially if you have tons of microservices running?
That's where things get really interesting. It's a balancing act, right? Data independence, but you also have to manage all that data spread out.
Right.
Luckily, cloud providers like AWS, they give you tons of options.
I bet.
DynamoDB for your NoSQL stuff,
Okay.
RDS if you need relational, even Elasticache for cache and data that gets used a lot.
Wow, so many choices. It's like a buffet of databases.
Yeah.
But how do you pick the right one for each microservice?
Well, first I look at the kind of data it needs. Structured, unstructured, complex relationships, or more like documents.
Okay.
Then performance. Does it need to handle a ton of reads and writes? Low latency.
Makes sense.
And lastly, how much work do I want to do? Fully managed solution or manage the database myself?
So it's like being an architect and a chef, all in one. Okay, let's say we've got our microservices built, databases running, our proxies directing traffic. How do we even know if it's working? Are we actually making progress strangling that monolith?
That's a key question, and it shows how iterative this whole process is. You need those metrics, those clear signs of success, and you got to track them closely.
Right, so what kind of metrics are we talking about? Is it just watching the traffic shift from the monolith to the new services?
That's definitely a big one. You can use monitoring tools to see how many requests each service is getting, response times, error rates. You get a real-time view of how that traffic's moving as you strangle more and more.
Like watching the blood flow change, so to speak. But are there other things we should be watching? Maybe not as obvious.
For sure. Think back to why you're doing this whole modernization thing in the first place. Faster releases, better scaling, lower costs.
Yeah, the business goals.
Right, define metrics that show that and track those two alongside your traffic patterns.
So it's not just about the technical stuff. It's about how it impacts the business.
Exactly. Are you releasing features faster? Is the application more stable? Can you handle those traffic spikes better? Those are the questions you got to answer as you go.
It's like a dashboard, showing us where we are and if we're going in the right direction. But let's be real. Even with the best plans, things go wrong. What are some of the, traps people fall into with this Strangler Fig pattern? And how'd you get past them?
One common one is underestimating the monolith. You think you found a nice clean boundary for microservice, then you start digging in the code and bam, all these hidden dependencies, tangled logic.
Like you think you found a path, then you're stuck in a thicket of thorns.
Yeah, exactly. That's why spending time up front Analyzing and planning, it's so crucial. Don't just assume you know how that monolith works. Dig in, talk to the people who built it, really understand it before you start carving it up.
Be like an archaeologist, carefully excavating the code.
Exactly.
But what if you find dependencies you didn't expect? What then? How do you adjust?
Being agile is key. You might need to change the scope of a microservice, break it down into smaller pieces.
Right.
Sometimes you need temporary workarounds, integrations, to handle those surprises.
Like a surgeon having to improvise during an operation.
That's a good one. And just like that surgeon, you got to stay calm, focused when those unexpected things pop up. Don't panic and make decisions that'll hurt your architecture in the long run.
Right. Thorough planning, staying flexible, and keeping your cool. What else trips people up? Any other pitfalls?
Data synchronization, it can be a real challenge. Those strategies we talked about, events, replication, they sound simple, but in practice, with lots of data, complex relationships, it gets tricky.
Yeah, we talked about those potential consistency problems, keeping everything coordinated, like trying to keep two clocks perfectly in sync even when they're ticking at different speeds.
That's a great way to put it. One way to make it easier is to start slow. Migrate smaller, less critical data first. Get some experience, refine your process before you touch the really important stuff.
Like testing the waters before you jump in the deep end.
Yeah.
Make sure everything's working before you risk messing up critical data.
Right. And communication is key here too. Keep everyone informed about how the migration's going, the possibility of some hiccups during those synchronization phases.
Okay.
Transparency and clear communication, they build trust and manage expectations.
Like navigating a ship through a narrow channel. Got to keep everyone on board informed about the course and the obstacles.
Exactly. And like a good captain, you got to communicate, see those challenges coming, adjust course when you need to.
This is great. We've talked about planning, agility, the data challenges, but before we wrap up this part, I want to shift gears a bit. Think about the people involved.
Sure.
We focused on the technical side, but how does this Strangler Fig thing affect the development team? How do we make this transition smooth for everyone?
That's a great point, and it often gets overlooked. This isn't just a technical change, it's a cultural one. You're asking your team to work in new ways, new technologies, a whole new mindset.
Right.
That can be hard, especially for teams that are used to that monolith, comfortable with it.
Like asking a sailor to trade their old ship for a fleet of speedboats.
Exactly. They might like the new stuff, but there's a learning curve. Some people might not want to let go of what they know. As a leader, one of the most important things you can do is create a culture of, safety. Encourage people to try stuff, learn from mistakes, celebrate the small wins.
So make it okay to experiment, to make mistakes without being afraid.
Exactly. And give them the training and support they need to learn those new skills. Don't just throw them in the deep end. Invest in good training, workshops, mentors. Help them become microservice experts.
Like giving the crew a training course before they take out those speedboats. Make sure they're ready.
Right. And as they learn and get confident, you'll see that cultural shift happen. They'll start to embrace that agility, that flexibility. They'll see the monolith not as a friend, but as something holding them back.
That's a powerful image. So we're not just strangling code, we're helping the team evolve.
Absolutely. That's key for this to really work.
This has been great. We've covered the technical details, the data, the cultural stuff. But before we wrap up, one more thing.
Yeah.
We've talked about all the good stuff, but what about the downsides? When would this Strangler Fig approach not be the right choice? What other options are there? You've done a lot of migrations. What do you think?
You're right. The Strangler Fig pattern, it's powerful, but it's not a magic solution. There are definitely times when it's not the best fit, and you want to know that early on before you go down the wrong path.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what are those situations? What are the warning signs?
One big one is if the monolith is just too small or too simple. The Strangler Fig can be overkill. If the application is small and contained, rewriting it from scratch might actually be faster and easier.
So if it's not that monstrous, a rewrite might be better.
Exactly. Like some of those PHP apps you migrated, if they were small, well-defined, rewriting them in Node.js probably wasn't too bad.
Yeah, sometimes a fresh start is just cleaner. But what if the monolith is big and complex, but the code is just, I don't know, spaghetti code, a tangled mess? Can you still use the Strangler Fig then?
That's another warning sign. If the components are all tangled up, dependencies everywhere, it's really hard to pull out those individual pieces and make nice, clean microservices.
So if it's more like a ball of yarn than a well-organized library.
That's it. In those cases, you might need a different approach. Maybe start by refactoring, modularizing the monolith before you try to extract microservices.
So like untangling that yarn before you can knit it into something new.
Exactly. Identify those boundaries between modules, add some good abstraction layers, reduce those dependencies, make the monolith easier to work with, and get it ready for eventual strangulation.
Like prepping the patient before surgery.
Exactly. And another option is a hybrid approach. Kind of mix the Strangler Fig with a traditional rewrite.
Oh, interesting.
Like, you might rewrite some core parts from scratch, but use the Strangler Fig to migrate the less important stuff gradually.
So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can mix and match.
Absolutely. And that's where your experience really comes in. You got to look at that monolith, the business goals, and choose the approach that balances the risk, complexity, and how fast you need to get it done.
Really good advice. There's no one right answer. It's about being adaptable, creative, thinking outside the box.
I agree. And as technology keeps changing, we got to keep learning new approaches, refining our strategies. Software development never stands still.
Very true. This has been a great deep dive. We've covered a lot, the technical details, the cultural stuff, the limitations of the pattern. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a few key takeaways. First, the Strangler Fig Pattern. It's a really powerful way to modernize those old applications. Move away from that monolithic architecture, get to those microservices, all gradually, without breaking things for your users or the business. But we got to remember, it's not a magic bullet. It's a process. You got to plan, execute, and be ready to adjust as you go.
I like to think of it as like guiding your application's evolution. You're not just changing code, you're changing how the whole system works and how your team works with it.
And that brings us to our second takeaway. This whole thing, it's as much about people as it is about technology.
Oh, yeah.
You're asking your team to think differently, use new tools, collaborate in new ways. That takes good leadership, clear communication, and supporting them every step of the way.
Absolutely. Training, mentoring, creating that environment where they can try things out without fear. That's so important. You want them to feel empowered, not overwhelmed.
Exactly. And our last takeaway, remember, the Strangler Fig is just one tool. There are others, and the best one always depends on your application, your goals, your team.
Right. Don't be afraid to explore, to experiment, to learn from what works and what doesn't. That's how we all get better as architects and as a community.
Couldn't agree more. So, to wrap up, I want to leave you with a challenge. Think about an application you've worked on, or one you know well. Could the Strangler Fig pattern have helped? What trade-offs do you see based on what we talked about today?
And remember, even if you never actually use the Strangler Fig pattern, understanding it makes you a better architect. More strategic, more adaptable.
It's all about expanding our options, finding new ways to solve those tough problems. So keep exploring, keep learning, keep thinking in new ways. That's what the deep dive is all about. Until next time, happy strangling.